Reese Malenko had been on Silvara for 3 days, and he still could not get used to the way light moved through the palace corridors. It bent around corners that should not exist, pooled in shadows that felt older than memory, and occasionally flickered with colors he was fairly certain did not appear in any human documented spectrum. His datapad kept insisting the hallways obeyed standard Euclidean geometry, which meant either his instruments were lying or the palace was, and Reese strongly suspected the latter. He walked with his eyes fixed on the holographic blueprint projected above his palm, tracing the skeletal outline of the temple's collapsed nave. The original builders, whoever or whatever they had been, had apparently decided that load-bearing columns were suggestions rather than requirements. The math should not work. The structure should have fallen centuries ago. Yet here it stood, humming with residual energy that made his teeth ache and his equipment throw tantrums. Gravitational anchor points, he muttered, zooming in on a series of nodes that pulsed faintly in the projection. Or maybe they just believed really hard, and the physics gave up arguing. His toolkit clinked against his hip as he walked, a reassuring weight of plasma torches and calibration wands, and the small flask of Terran whiskey he had smuggled past customs. 3 days into a 6-month contract, and he was already fantasizing about that flask. The ethereal conclave had hired him because he was the best at restoring impossible architecture, but they had failed to mention that their palace actively resented being understood. Reese rounded a corner, still absorbed in the blueprint's stubborn refusal to make sense, and walked directly into another person. The impact was not gentle. His datapad went flying, spinning through the air in a graceful arc before clattering against obsidian tile. His toolkit slipped from his shoulder and hit the floor with an expensive-sounding crash. Reese stumbled, caught himself against the wall, and began what he knew would be a deeply embarrassing apology. "I am so sorry, I was not looking. I have the spatial awareness of a concussed sparrow." He looked up and forgot how words worked. The woman standing before him was tall, pale as winter moonlight, her skin so luminous it seemed to gather the corridor's strange light and hold it. Black hair fell past her shoulders in a cascade that absorbed every photon it touched, creating an absence of color so complete it felt like staring into deep space. She wore silk that shifted between midnight blue and something darker, something that might have been the color of thoughts left unspoken. Her ears rose to elegant points, sweeping upward in a curve that would have looked absurd on a human, but on her seemed as natural as breathing. Her eyes were the darkest thing about her, black as collapsed stars, and they fixed on him with an expression he could not begin to parse. Reese's brain supplied several important facts in rapid succession. This was Queen Ashira. This was the sovereign of the ethereal conclave. This was his employer, the person who could end his contract with a word and possibly end him with another. This was extremely bad. "Your Majesty," he managed, which seemed inadequate but was at least pronounced correctly. "I did not see. I was reviewing the structural. There is no excuse. I should have been." She moved closer, and Reese forgot whatever he had been about to say. She leaned in, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, close enough that her breath ghosted across his ear when she spoke. "Do you desire my body, human?" The words were soft, intimate, utterly calm. They were also the most dangerous thing anyone had ever said to him, and Reese had once been shot at by a client who disagreed with his billing practices. His heart stopped, restarted, attempted to exit his chest entirely. Before he could formulate anything resembling a response, before his brain could process whether she had actually said what he thought she had said, Queen Ashira straightened. Her attendants appeared from nowhere, materializing from alcoves Reese would have sworn were empty moments before. They were a flutter of concerned voices and formal gestures, creating a barrier between their queen and the clumsy human who had assaulted her in her own corridor. Ashira said something in the musical, liquid language of the conclave. Her tone was unchanged, as though she had been discussing weather patterns rather than asking questions that violated approximately 17 diplomatic protocols. Then she walked away, her attendants flowing around her like a ceremonial guard, and Reese was left standing alone in a corridor that suddenly felt several degrees colder. He stared at the space where she had been. His datapad lay on the floor. "What?" Reese said to the empty air. "Was that?" The palace offered no answer, though its walls hummed with what might have been amusement or might have been ancient machinery slowly failing. With this place, it was genuinely difficult to tell the difference. Reese bent to retrieve his equipment, his hands shaking slightly, and tried very hard to convince himself he had imagined the entire interaction. Queens did not whisper impossible questions to architects they had just met. Queens certainly did not lean close enough to make every nerve ending forget how to function properly. He had misheard. He had misunderstood. The palace's atmospheric processors were leaking something hallucinogenic. Any explanation was better than the alternative. That Queen Ashira had asked him a question he had no idea how to answer, and that he was now going to spend the next 6 months working in her palace, seeing her at formal inspections and technical reviews, while that question hung between them like a blade waiting to fall. Reese picked up his datapad and looked at the temple blueprints with their impossible geometry and their casual defiance of physical law. "You know what?" he said to the projected architecture. "You are not even the most confusing thing in this palace anymore." The blueprint pulsed once, as if in agreement, and Reese walked back toward his quarters with a distinct feeling that his carefully planned renovation project had just become far more complicated than anything involving ancient alien construction techniques had any right to be. The scaffolding groaned as Reese climbed to the upper levels of the throne room, his boots finding purchase on rungs that felt disturbingly organic for something made of metal. Below him, a crew of conclave engineers stood in a loose cluster, their pointed ears twitching with what he had learned to recognize as professional skepticism. They did not trust his methods. They did not trust his equipment. They especially did not trust the fact that he had suggested using a Terran gravity damper to stabilize a ceiling that had stood for 3,000 years without collapsing. "The stress fractures are minimal," one of them called up in accented standard. "Your instruments exaggerate the danger." Reese resisted the urge to drop something on the engineer's head, if only because it would prove the man's point about Terran impulsiveness. Instead, he aimed his laser scanner at the vaulted ceiling and watched the readout paint a map of invisible cracks spreading through stone like frozen lightning. "Minimal is a fascinating word," he shouted down. "I also use it to describe flesh wounds and minor apocalypses." A sound behind him made him turn too quickly. The scaffolding swayed and Reese grabbed a support beam while his stomach attempted to relocate to his throat. When the world stopped moving, Queen Ashira stood on the platform 3 meters away, her hands clasped behind her back, looking as though she had simply materialized from the palace's perpetually uncertain lighting. She wore something simpler today, a high-collared garment in deep gray that made her pale skin seem luminous by contrast. Her black hair was bound in an intricate series of braids that Reese suspected had symbolic significance he was entirely unqualified to interpret. "Your Majesty," he said, which came out slightly strangled, because his heart had not yet recovered from the scaffolding's betrayal. "I did not hear you approach. I have been told I move quietly." She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the ceiling above them. "What have you found?" Reese held up the scanner, grateful for the excuse to look at something other than her face. The readout showed a web of fault lines converging on the throne room's central point, where a crystalline column rose from floor to ceiling like a frozen scream. "The column is putting stress on the entire structure," he explained. "Whatever it was not designed to bear this much weight. Or maybe it was. But something changed. The gravitational constant, the planetary rotation, the collective mood of the universe." The engineers below watched their descent with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright alarm. By the time they reached the throne room floor, the crew had discovered urgent tasks that required their immediate attention elsewhere. Ashira led him through a doorway that Reese was certain had not existed 5 minutes ago. The palace did that, revealed rooms when it felt like it, hid corridors when it grew bored. They emerged onto a balcony that overlooked Silvara's silver forests, where trees grew in geometric patterns that suggested cultivation by species with very different aesthetic sensibilities than humans. The moon's pale sun hung low on the horizon, casting everything in shades of mercury and pearl. Somewhere in the distance, something that might have been a bird or might have been a drone traced lazy circles through the air. "You are the 5th architect I have commissioned," Ashira said without preamble. The others found reasons to leave before completing their work. Reese leaned against the balcony railing, which was either stone or metal or possibly condensed moonlight, and considered this information. Did the palace frighten them away, or was it something else? Does it matter? Architecturally speaking, yes. If the building is hostile, I can work with that. If the problem is political, I am substantially less equipped to help. She turned to face him fully, and Reese found himself pinned by that dark gaze. Do I frighten you, Reese Malenko? The use of his first name felt deliberate, intimate in a way that made his pulse quicken. He thought about lying, decided against it, and opted for a truth that felt safer than the whole truth. Your Majesty, I am a man who climbs unstable structures for a living. My relationship with fear is complicated. That is not an answer. It is the best answer I have at the moment. Ask me again in a few weeks when I have had time to develop a more coherent philosophy. This time she did smile, brief and genuine, and Reese felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with gravity dampers or structural integrity. The moment stretched between them, filled with the whisper of wind through silver trees and the hum of the palace behind them, always present, always watching. The column in the throne room, Ashira said eventually. It was placed there by the architects of silence. They built this palace as a gift and a prison, though history has forgotten which they intended. That sounds ominous. Most history is ominous if you examine it closely enough. She moved to stand beside him at the railing, close enough that her sleeve brushed his arm. Reese carefully did not react, though every nerve ending had opinions about the contact. The column is an anchor point. It connects this structure to something deeper than stone, something that exists in the spaces between thought and matter. So when I suggested we stabilize it with a gravity damper, I was proposing to place a mechanical bandage on a metaphysical wound. Yes, Reese laughed despite himself. In my defense, metaphysical wounds are outside my usual area of expertise. Then you will learn. Ashira's voice carried absolute certainty, as though his education in impossible physics was already a settled fact. The palace chose you, Reese Malenko. It let you see the fractures. It showed you where the damage runs deepest. The others saw only stone. I am still not sure that is a compliment. It was not meant to be. It was a statement of fact. She turned away from the balcony, her braids catching the fading light. Tomorrow I will show you the observation deck of my ceremonial vessel. There are structural elements there that may help you understand what the column truly is. Before Reese could ask what a ceremonial vessel had to do with ancient architecture, she was gone, moving back through the doorway with that unnerving silence. He stood alone on the balcony, watching Silvara's sun sink toward the silver horizon, and tried to calculate how badly he had underestimated this contract. The palace hummed around him, and Reese could have sworn it sounded amused. The ceremonial vessel turned out to be less a ship and more a probability error made physical. Reese stood in what his instruments insisted was the cargo bay, staring at walls that curved in directions his eyes refused to track properly. The space felt simultaneously vast and claustrophobic, as though it existed in more dimensions than the standard 3, and was only grudgingly condensing itself into something human perception could approximate. This is giving me a headache, he announced to the empty air. That is normal, Queen Ashira replied from directly behind him. Reese did not jump, but only because his nervous system had given up on processing surprises around her. He turned to find her holding a crystalline device that glowed with internal light, dressed in something flowing and dark that seemed designed to make her look like a particularly elegant shadow. How long have you been standing there? Long enough to watch you attempt to measure a wall that exists in 5 spatial dimensions with a tool designed for 3. She moved past him, the crystalline device casting shifting patterns across the impossible geometry. The vessel was grown, not built. The architects of silence cultivated it from folded space over the course of centuries. Grown, of course. Why would anything on this moon make conventional sense? Reese followed her deeper into the bay, his boots finding purchase on flooring that felt solid but looked translucent. Below them, or possibly beside them, shapes moved through what might have been other decks, or might have been other realities entirely. I am starting to think the architects of silence earned their name by being too confused to speak. They earned it by understanding that some truths cannot survive translation into language. Ashira stopped before what Reese had assumed was a support column, but now recognized as something far stranger. It spiraled upward and downward simultaneously, its surface covered in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "This is what I wanted you to see." Reese approached carefully, extending his scanner. The readout immediately produced numbers that should not exist, including what appeared to be a negative distance measurement and a temperature reading in imaginary units. "My equipment is having a philosophical crisis." "Your equipment is finally being honest about what it perceives." Ashira placed her hand against the column's surface, and the patterns shifted, responding to her touch. "This is similar to the structure in the throne room. Not identical, but related. Like siblings born from the same impossible thought." "So when you asked me to stabilize the throne room column, I was asking you to stabilize something that defies stabilization?" "Yes." She withdrew her hand and the patterns slowly stilled. The previous architects realized this and left. They could not accept that their tools were inadequate. Reese studied the column, then his useless scanner, then Ashira's profile in the strange light. "You know, most clients who hire me actually want their buildings fixed. This feels more like an elaborate test designed to highlight my professional limitations. Would you leave if it were?" The question hung between them, and Reese realized it mattered to her in a way that had nothing to do with architecture. He thought about the easy answer, the professional answer, the answer that would maintain appropriate boundaries between an architect and a queen. "No," he said instead. "I would just complain more aggressively while I worked." She laughed, quiet and genuine, and the sound did something dangerous to Reese's carefully maintained composure. When she looked at him, her expression had shifted into something he could not name, but felt keenly. "The architects of silence built in paradoxes," she said. "They created structures that exist in multiple states simultaneously. The throne room column is both supporting the palace and pulling it apart. It is both ancient and newly formed. It is both here and somewhere else entirely." That sounds exhausting for a piece of architecture. "It is exhausting for everything." Ashira moved away from the column, her fingers trailing along a wall that rippled at her touch. "My people believe the palace is a gift, a symbol of our connection. I think everything has a price." She moved to stand before the observation window, her reflection ghosting across the view of the moon below. "I think the architects of silence gave us something beautiful and impossible, and somewhere in the beauty and impossibility, there is a trap waiting to close." Reese joined her at the window, close enough to see her expression reflected in the transparent surface. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, as though the weight of understanding too much was slowly pressing her down. "Tell me about Earth," she said suddenly. "Tell me about human structures. Do they ever feel like prisons?" "All the time," Reese admitted. "Humans are excellent at building cages and calling them homes. We just use more conventional materials. Concrete instead of folded space. Steel instead of crystallized thought. But the principle is the same. Do you ever escape them?" "Sometimes, usually by going somewhere else and building new cages with slightly better views." He watched her reflection, the way her expression shifted in the window's surface. "Why do you ask?" She was quiet for a long moment, and Reese could feel something building in the silence. Some question or confession that she was weighing against whatever protocols and cautions governed her life. "I asked you something once," she said finally. "In the corridor. You never answered." Reese's heart performed a complicated maneuver that involved stopping and accelerating simultaneously. He remembered the collision, her whispered question, the way the words had felt like a blade pressed against his throat. "I did not know how to answer. And now?" Before he could formulate a response that would not destroy every professional boundary he had left, alarms screamed through the vessel. The observation window flickered, and the geometric cities below suddenly looked wrong, their patterns disrupted by darkness, spreading through sections like a stain. Ashira stiffened, her hand going to a communication device at her wrist. She spoke in rapid conclave, her voice sharp with command, and received responses that made her expression go cold. "What is happening?" Reese asked. "The throne room," she said. "The column. It is failing." They ran through corridors that reorganized themselves around their urgency, the vessel seeming to understand the crisis and reshape its interior into the shortest possible path. Behind them, the observation window showed Silvara's cities flickering like dying stars, and Reese realized with cold certainty that whatever was happening in the throne room was not just structural. It was spreading. The throne room looked like reality had developed a crack and was slowly leaking out. The central column pulsed with light that existed somewhere between violet and a color Reese was certain no human language had named, and each pulse sent ripples through the air that made his vision double. The engineers had evacuated, which Reese considered a sensible response to metaphysical structural failure. Queen Ashira stood before the column, with her arms raised, speaking in a language that predated the conclave by millennia. The words felt heavy as though they carried more mass than sound should possess. "What are you doing?" Reese shouted over the increasing hum that vibrated through his bones. "Asking it to stop," she called back without turning. The architects of silence built a question into this structure. It has been asking that question for 3,000 years, and tonight it finally expects an answer. Reese moved closer, his scanner forgotten in his toolkit. The column's surface showed patterns now, the same impossible geometry he had seen on the ceremonial vessel, but moving, alive, reaching. "What question?" "Whether we deserve what we were given." Ashira's voice cracked on the final word, and the column pulsed brighter in response. "Whether we understand the gift or merely covet it. Whether we are worthy of beauty that transcends our comprehension." "That is a terrible question," Reese said. "Who gets to define worthy? Who decided the architects of silence were qualified to judge an entire civilization?" The column flickered, and for a moment the pattern stilled. Ashira turned to look at him, her face illuminated by impossible light, her expression caught between hope and exhaustion. "You do not fear it." "I am terrified of it," Reese corrected, "but I am also extremely tired of ancient civilizations leaving booby traps disguised as architecture. If the architects of silence wanted an answer, they should have asked clearly instead of building a palace that doubles as an existential examination." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The column loomed above them, its surface now showing what looked like equations written in light, mathematical expressions that described the relationship between thought and matter. "In my professional opinion," Reese said, addressing the column directly, "this is the worst client communication I have ever encountered. You build a palace, gift it to a civilization, and then make the entire structure dependent on them solving a philosophical riddle they did not know they were supposed to answer? That is not architecture. That is entrapment with delusions of profundity." Ashira stared at him. "You are insulting the architects of silence. They are not here to be offended, and frankly, they deserve it." Reese pulled out his scanner, which was still producing nonsense readings, but at least provided the comfort of familiar technology. "Here is what I think happened. The architects built this place as a test, yes, but not the test everyone assumes. They did not care if you were worthy. They cared if you would ask whether worthiness even mattered." The column's pulsing slowed, the light dimming slightly. Ashira stepped closer to Reese, her hand finding his arm. "Explain." "The previous architects left because they could not fix what was breaking. They saw a problem with no solution and decided the problem must be unsolvable." Reese gestured at the column with his scanner. "But what if the breaking is the point? What if the architects of silence built something designed to fail, to force you to choose between preserving their gift and destroying it to save yourselves? That is monstrous. That is honest." Reese met her eyes, seeing his own reflection in their darkness. "You asked me a question once, in the corridor. Do you remember?" Her breath caught. "Yes. You asked if I desired your body, and I did not answer because I was terrified of what the answer meant. But here is the truth. I desire you in ways I do not have language for. I desire your presence and your questions and the way you look at impossible things and refuse to accept that they are impossible. And that terrifies me because desire is complicated and dangerous, and it makes you vulnerable." The column blazed brighter, but the light felt different now, less like a threat and more like recognition. "The architects of silence built a palace that asks if you can accept a gift without understanding it," Reese continued. "But the real question is whether you can accept desire without demanding it make sense, whether you can want something impossible and choose it anyway." Ashira's hand tightened on his arm. You are suggesting I answer their ancient question with honesty instead of worthiness, with choice instead of permission. Reese turned to face her fully, letting his scanner clatter to the floor. The column is not breaking because you failed some test. It is breaking because it wants you to decide what matters more, preserving what you were given or creating something new from the ruins. She kissed him then, fierce and sudden, her hands fisting in his jacket. The column erupted with light that felt like approval, or possibly just relief that someone had finally understood the joke. When they broke apart, the throne room was quiet. The column still stood, but its surface had gone dark, inert, just stone after all. Did we just solve 3,000 years of architectural philosophy with a declaration of inappropriate feelings? Reese asked. I believe we did. Ashira was laughing, breathless and genuine. The architects of silence built a question that could only be answered by refusing to answer it properly. That tracks. Ancient civilizations love being cryptic. Reese looked around at the throne room, now just a room, beautiful but no longer impossible.